Hello and welcome to the Answer is Yes podcast. This is the Baja Sessions show. And in typical fashion, I ran into my good buddy Ryan Thomas not too long ago. And usually I'm running into him at the airport or somewhere heading to Mexico. So I've got him on the line. Hey, Ryan, how you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing wonderful, Jim. How are you?
Not too bad. You are literally the guy that you run into on your way to Mexico. Like, that's happened to us a few times.
It literally happened. You are 100% correct. Actually, it was Jim Hancock and I'm pretty sure. We were headed down for a nice, relaxing, sober trip to Baja, and we run into you and Rick Johnson, the tequila guys. And we all know how that turned out.
It was not a sober trip anymore.
Good times, though. Good memories.
Yeah, well, what I love about it is that you are somebody that is just synonymous with Baja in my mind. You've got a place down there. You've been going down there for a lot of years, a lot of history. And I always feel like if I needed to know something about Baja, you'd be one of those guys to call. And that's why I called today.
Yeah, beyond just going there, lived there for a decade. Actually, had been there long enough, and it made sense. By about 2006, I applied for naturalization and actually became a citizen as well. So I'm a dual citizen.
Wow. So how long have you been going down to Baja? Like, when was your first trip? Do you remember?
Well, my first trip would have been back in the mid 80s I don't even know if I was a teenager at that point. My dad owned a company called Cheneth Racing Products that, we built race cars back in the day for most of the teams. So I grew up in and around the sport of off-road racing my entire life, and fortunate in that regard. Blessing and a curse, some people say, but my earliest recollection of being in Mexico was in Ojos Negros, of all places. I don't think I was a teenager yet because it still seemed like a long ways away from when I would actually get to drive a race car. Mm-hmm. But I remember waking up and the race was actually coming through the town of Ojos Negros, not out on the highway. And we were in our motorhome, and I had literally just woken up to walk outside of the motorhome and see Walker Evans come flying around a 90-degree turn sideways. He was the first truck to Ojos, and that's my earliest recollection of being in Mexico. So I was probably 9 or 10.
Yeah. You'd before we started the show, you'd mentioned a trip for spring break. What was that trip all about? You were talking about being down there on the beach and stuff.
Well, that's a big jump forward from 9 or 10 to 19 or 20, but that was in 1990. And, I'd gone on a surf trip with some guys from San Diego State, and we were just down there surfing, and I camped on Mirador that overlooks what's now the Cabo Surf Hotel. And again, it was a 2-lane road and that Mirador was all dirt, and you could actually camp there. It today is a fast-moving highway and a parking lot. But if you'd have told me then, 10 years from that date, I would own a house just a stone's throw away and be living there full-time, I would have thought you were crazy. And not necessarily because it wasn't something that I would be interested in doing, but it just didn't seem like anything on the horizon at that point in time, just in the middle of college and trying to figure life out. And who knew that figuring life out was going to lead me to a home and a life in Baja, which I don't regret in any capacity. From that earliest memory of seeing a truck slide around a corner in Ojos Negros to, we didn't talk about this one. I could probably raise my hand as one of the few people who had their high school prom dinner in Puerto Nuevo. We found 2 limousines that would cross the border. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So we went to Puerto Nuevo for lobster dinner when we were the night of our prom, and went back to the United States to go to the actual prom. But our dinner was down in Puerto Nuevo. So yeah, it's been a lifelong love affair, and it's not over. I still have my home there, and my heart is still there. I live here in San Diego today, but and it's far more than the surf. It's far more than the off-road racing, it's even far more than the people. The people are great and all of that, but it's really more of I think that so much of Baja California, well, I know that Baja California was like California was 100 years ago, and I guess that's maybe why I like it so much. It's a little bit rustic, a little bit destitute. There's all different walks of life. When they used to call, when we lived in Cabo, we called Cabo the sunny place for shady people. So you get to meet some interesting people when you live there, for sure.
Yep. Now, you talked about in the 90s that highway, what didn't exist, it was basically dirt roads and not much there. And I know that it's built up since. Of course, you just described that. But, a lot of places in between, call it Ensenada and Cabo, are still those wonderful, very rarely traveled cities and places in between. Isn't that still the case?
I would say 90% of it is that way. Yeah. And it's interesting when you think about people that travel to Baja and think they've actually seen it when they go to Ensenada or go to Cabo or even go to La Paz, any of the major cities. I mean, it is obviously Baja, and God bless anybody that's willing to go on an adventure to another country. But the real Baja starts when you leave the pavement, and you meet people that purposely. I mean, they know that the cities exist. They know that the modern luxuries exist, but they choose to stay on their ranches without power and running water and live a more rustic lifestyle. And you see some of these old guys out in the fields when you're out in the middle of nowhere, and you look at them and think they're 65 or 70 years old, and wow, they're looking good for being that age. And then you sit down and talk to them and realize they're 85 or sometimes even 90.
Yeah.
And just the quality of life when you live that lifestyle, I think there's a lot of health benefits to it for sure.
Well, and I think you also bring up a good point when you said when you actually sit down and you talk with that person. And that's the cool part about it, because the people that live in that country and the areas that you're talking about are so gracious and willing to sit down and talk with you and share their life with you or share a meal with you or help you with something. And I think that's often overlooked about one of the joys of just being down in Baja.
It's funny. You just asked me earlier about my earliest recollection, and I forgot another one that's even earlier than that, and it ties back into what you're just saying. Back in the it was the late 70s, mid to late 70s. I know I wasn't 10. I was born in 72, but my dad had broke down south of Bay of LA, just outside of San Francisco, and that was pre-radios, pre-GPSs, pre-sat phones, pre-everything. When you broke, and you stayed there. And it ultimately ended up staying at a ranch for like a day and a half, 2 days. His family took him in and more or less took care of him.
Uh-huh.
And so that was the Baja 1000. And my memory around that, I wasn't around for that part of it, but Christmas time, we loaded up 2 vans full of presents and food and supplies, and my dad and his race team and myself included, we went down and took all this stuff down to this family that had taken him in during the race. And it was more than just the family. We kind of spread it around throughout the different ranches that were down there. But yeah, a perfect example of how the people in the remote areas, they're just good, genuine, loving people that are happy to see you 99% of the time and willing to lend a hand and in the same breath can use a helping hand every once in a while as well. And that's one of the things that's so cool about some of the people that you and I both hang around with, man. The Cameron Steele just raising, I think they got close to $150,000 for the Rancho Santa Marta orphanage a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, they sure did.
So it's nice to be a part of groups that are also giving back and lending those helping hands because they go both directions for sure.
Yeah, and I think because our world is off-road racing, and for me it's the wine country now. But this is across the board with the fishermen that go down there from the U.S. and the kiteboarders and the adventurers and just the travelers. You see all of them exchanging both values, not only with the people, but back and forth. So I just think it's synonymous with the region itself, this give back and this value for value philosophy.
Especially when you're a guest. I mean, it's amazing how you get treated when you're a guest, and so much of the time, I think a lot of times people travel to foreign places and forget that they're a guest in those places, and it's amazing when you function like a guest how you get treated.
Yeah. Ryan, you know so much about Baja, and I know you're partners with Jim Hancock on the Baja Map, which is at thebahamap.com. And you're with BFG and working with those guys and kind of the typical things. But what I don't have a lot of people on the show talk about is their dual citizenship and actually having a house down there. So, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what made you decide that you were comfortable enough to buy a place down there? Because I know that's a question I get a lot is, wow, it's beautiful down there. Can I buy a place? Is it safe? I mean, how do you do that and all those things? I mean, could you give us the 5-second version of that or the 1 minute or 2 minute, whatever it takes?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of bad press back 15, 20, maybe even 30 years ago that resulted from a debacle that happened up in Ensenada, actually by beach, that peninsula down there, and that's all of what you really got to do is make sure you have clear title. And back in that time period, there was some misunderstandings about how an ejido, which is a more or less a big extended family that was granted land by the Mexican government several hundred years ago. That land is not private land, it's not public land. It's owned as a group, and until it is privatized and subdivided, it's not sellable. And there were a group of Americans that thought they bought a bunch of land down there south of Ensenada and built their retirement homes. And then when the rest of the ejido members found out about it, they wanted their cut of the sale. Well, it turns out the other family members weren't able to really sell it, and it opened up this big debacle. But at the end of the day, the Mexican Constitution states that I believe it's 60 kilometers from any coastline or international border a foreigner can't own land, and the reason for that is to protect their national sovereignty, is what I've been told. And rather than going and amend the Constitution, which I guess is a major ordeal in Mexico, they instituted the fideicomiso, which is a trust that you can purchase a property as a foreigner and hold the title in the trust, and then you are the beneficiary of the trust, and you have all the same rights that you would as a real property owner. And that's a way to circumvent the Mexican Constitution as a foreigner. And actually, when I got my citizenship, I looked into transferring my house from being in the trust into a fee simple title. And a good friend of mine, who is a very well-respected Mexican attorney down in Cabo, asked me, why do you want to do this? And I said, I just to kind of have one more level of security. And he says, what, you mean like you're afraid that the Mexican government would take your house away? And I said, well, I guess so. I'm not really, but. And he said, listen, the only way that is ever going to be an issue. He said, even then it probably wouldn't be, but the only way it would ever be an issue is if the United States went to war with Mexico.
Yeah.
And then he said, something tells me you're not going to be so worried about your house in Mexico if that happens. And I said, yeah, you're probably right. So,
yeah.
No, the concern of foreigners, you can't be negligent when it comes to a title search, and there's U.S. title insurance companies that will insure the title down there. So, and you get title insurance on a property even if it is in the trust. So, I don't think there's anything to be concerned with as long as you are surrounding yourself with the right people. And if it's too good to be true, then it's too good to be true. Or if it seems too good to be true, then it is.
It's just like anywhere else, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's what I try to tell people. And then what about like bank financing, all those things? Is it only a cash deal, or do you have financing down there? How does all that work?
Well, yeah, there's definitely, and I've been away now for, almost 9 years, so I'm not immersed in that part of life down there.
Yeah.
I know credit was something that was just starting to happen in early 2000s when I was living there. Credit for the average person. I can remember a couple employees when they got their first credit cards. It was a big deal.